I wanted to thank you all for coming. My name is Gary Schendel, and at the last Colorado convention, Dave Hughes, myself, Ernst Castine, Alex Sproul, and a number of others got together and thought that we should try and develop a program related to taking some of the early and important members of the NSS and see if we could get them to give us a background or history on their caving careers, their science careers, etc. So we have 3 wonderful speakers lined up today, tomorrow, and the next day, all at 1 o'clock. Today we have Jeanne Gurnee, tomorrow is Will White, and the following day will be Dwight Deal. And so I hope you enjoy this. I'd like to turn this over to Dave Hughes, who's going to introduce our speakers, and we'll go from there. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the premier presentation in the NSS Luminary series. We hope that this is a series that will continue for many years, but for those of you in the audience today, you will have the privilege of telling your grandchildren that you were there during the very first presentation. A few housekeeping things before we begin. Please be aware that the entirety of these presentations are being both video and audio recorded, so I'm sure that you'll show your usual courtesy for recordings in progress. And please turn off your cell phones and other noise-making devices. Mrs. Gurnee has graciously agreed to stay a little bit afterwards. She'll be sitting at a table out in the hallway, so if you have not had a chance to meet her in person, that would be a wonderful opportunity to do so. And Jeanne will be happy to, for example, have a picture taken with you or sign some of her wonderful books. Wow, this is Jeanne Gurnee. The very mention of that name just brings back so many wonderful memories. In more than a half of a century of speleological adventuring, Jeanne has traveled to 6 continents, dozens of countries, and has operated all over the wonderful United States of America. Along the way, Jeanne has served the NSS and some of the related organizations in nearly every imaginable capacity. For example, Jeanne and her late husband Russell are the only husband and wife that have ever separately been both presidents of the NSS. Jeanne's storytelling skills, her charm, her grace, her dignity are legendary in the caving community and beyond, and it is a tremendous honor indeed to present to you folks Mrs. Jeanne Gurnee.
I'm wired for sound here, so if you wait just a minute. Am I on? Okay. Well, it's a great pleasure to talk for you today, and I see so many people that I've known for many years, so I'm sure that I'm going to be sharing with you some experiences that maybe you had along with me and along with Russell and me. When Gary telephoned me and said that he'd like to have me talk, about 50 years of exploration sort of flashed through my mind, and I thought, oh my goodness, how am I ever going to select something, you know? And so I said, I have a choice of 2 things. I can either select particular things that are outstanding in my mind, or I can try and cover everything and talk very fast. So I decided that I will select the things that I think you might enjoy. But first I'd like to take you with me back in time. I discovered the NSS when I was at a lecture of a man from the Academy of Science in Philadelphia, and he mentioned speleology, a word I had never heard before, and caves. And so after he got finished talking, I went up and I said, you know, my husband and I, on our wedding trip, stopped off at all of the show caves along the Shenandoah Valley, and we just loved it. And you know, how do we get connected with this group? And he said, well, they have a grotto, he said, which is a chapter in the American Museum of Natural History in New York City. And he said, I'm sure they will welcome you there. So when I got home, I said, Russ, do you know they have absolutely an organization that does nothing but explore caves? How could it be so great? So needless to say, we were off to the grotto meeting, and they welcomed us with open arms, as grotto members do, and set us on a path that I'm still on today. I do remember the first president of the National Speleological Society, Bill Stevenson, and also the men who came after him as president. And Bill really had a mission. When he formed the NSS, he had a very serious mission. He really wanted to gather together all those people and be able to have them know how to cave properly. I can remember caving with him, and we'd be walking along in a cave, and he'd see another group of cavers coming from another direction. And he'd say, "Hello there, are you a member of the NSS?" And invariably the person would say, "The what?" At which time Bill would whip out a brochure he had with a membership thing on it and hand it to him and say, "Come over here, I want to talk with you about what this is." Because he believed that people should know how to cave properly, and this was a way to get people in grottos, because grottos are the heart of our organization, and that was one reason why I wanted to get into internal organizations, because it's very difficult. We have ocean to ocean, a very large country, and sometimes, particularly in the West, they feel a little bit disconnected from the central NSS. That shouldn't be. So I started the internal organization newsletter, and every month in a terrible printing machine, I wrote the news and mailed it out to all the various grottos. I think what happens, and probably when you are volunteering, is that you see a need and you fulfill it, and that's what people do in the NSS. I never imagined, though, after knowing all of these presidents, what was ahead for me in 1992. That was the furthest thing from my imagination. Nor did I imagine that I would be caving in more than 40 countries around the world, and many continents, 6 continents, and I mean, that whole future was completely unknown to me in those early days. I've been thinking about what makes us have a sustained interest in caves. There are a lot of organizations, you know, where you can have social interchange, and we have that too at conventions and on trips, but we know that the big attraction is those holes in the ground. And I know people who have sustained their interest for many years, just as I have. The most exciting, though, I think, is the hope of discovery. And for those of you who have discovered either a new cave or broken into a room in a cave, you never forget that experience. You know, I remember it as if it were yesterday. Of course, there were no cameras there at the time, but I remember walking into a room and my footprints were the only ones in the soil. And I'm sure some of you have experienced that. I remember there was a rock that had rolled down, and all you saw was where the rock had rolled, and then there was a bat skeleton in the floor. And I even hesitated walking in the room. It was so perfect, and the moment was so perfect. The 1950s, probably before many of you were born, we went into the couple of shaked heads here. Russ and I went to the editor of Natural History magazine, and we had proposed an expedition to South America. The editor looked at us with disdain and said, "Original exploration is dead. There is no such thing. Maybe NASA would go to the moon or something someday, but certainly it's dead." Well, of course, for you and me, this is absolutely impossible, and all you have to do is open up the NSS News or the Journal, and we see a lot of original work being done by our organization. In those early days, the International Speleological Union was also in its infancy, and we began attending those congresses every 4 years. The first one we went to was in Bari, Italy. It was the second International Congress, and I remember we looked around and we didn't see, at least we didn't meet any other people from our side of the Atlantic. It seemed like it was all Europeans there. They sort of looked at us askance, I felt, and thought that they have been writing scholarly journals and books since the 1880s, and here come these people from the other side of the globe. They must be beginners. So this was our first introduction to international congresses. Back then, there were no jet planes, there were no rental cars at airports, there were no iPods, iPhones, all those things. There were no computers, no email. And so you can imagine that making contact was almost nil. As I see people today, I think that our cell phones are an extension of our hands. We feel naked if we don't have it in our hand. So you can imagine that the way we had to contact each other at that time is to take a typewriter, write a letter, fold it up, put it in an envelope, put a 3-cent stamp on it, and send it. You have that or telephone, or in the dire circumstances, you would send a telegram. So gas cost about 23 cents a gallon, and we had 3 sources of light like everybody else. At that time, it was a candle with matches, a flashlight, and a carbide lamp on your helmet. So I'm sure some of you remember all those things. So I'd like to take you with me now on some of the experiences that I hope that you would like to join me on. So if we can have the lights, we'll begin. On that first trip to Europe in the 1950s, we met the father of French speleology, and that was Norbert Castoret. I had enthusiastically read his book, 10 Years Under the Earth, and I'm sure probably many of you have read it too, where he described his lone exploits. Here he's standing with a cable ladder that was originated by his friend Robert Desjolies. And you know, we call them the Desjolies ladders. And some of you may remember that this began the making of cable ladders here in the U.S. Oh, I hope I didn't hit that twice. Castoret's book describes how on one of his solo cave explorations, he removed all his clothing, put matches and a candle and a rubber bathing cap on his head, and jumped in the frigid waters of a previously unexplored cave. Holding his breath, he dived down and swam until he came to dry passage. He describes his feeling of terror as he held his breath, traversing the siphon. Pretty foolhardy in most of cavers' judgment, but his lone exploits became legendary. Castoret told us that we should not leave Europe until we had seen a cave he would like to show us. And so we met him at his home in Saint-Gaudens, and the 3 of us traveled to Gargas Cave in the Pyrenees. Here we see Castoret looking at handprints of prehistoric people. I was shocked to see that many of the fingers had been cut off. Over 20,000 years ago, the hands had been placed against the cave wall and dry pigment, either in red or black, blown over them. Scientists think that these digits were severed upon the death of a loved one. This is a map of the Pyrenees. I know those of you in the back can't see the type, but this is France here, Spain over here, and many of the caves of prehistory are right at the foot of the Pyrenees. Lascaux, Mastacil, many, and on all of the trips, Trois Frères, Montespan, we would cover as many as we could. We also went over to the Spanish side, Altamira, which is excellent, and then there was an international congress in Pamplona, which is about down here, and we hiked up in the Pyrenees to a cave called Pierre Saint-Martin. Some of you may be familiar with it. It's a very famous pit cave, very deep, and another Castoret explored cave. When he and his team member, Marcel Lubin, went in the cave, and the vertical drop is tremendous, and unfortunately the winch failed, and Martin met his death. It's hard to... While we pale, sophisticated cavers look back on these Neanderthal and Cro-Magnon creatures as primitive and uncivilized, but were they? Here's today's rendering of a mammoth, one of the animals that roamed the area of Europe over 20,000 years ago. And the next picture is of a prehistoric artist's rendering of the same animal as he etched it on a cave wall with remarkable accuracy. This is another thing that interested me. This is Peshmerl, and you see where the nose and the head conforms to the shape of the rock there. So that there's a degree of sophistication there that I think people miss when they think of primitive people. Here we see that we had the wondrous experience of visiting Lascaux, guided by Jacques Marsal, who is pictured here with 3 others who, when they were young boys in 1940, discovered the cave. The cave is closed now. I brought this picture so that you could see the development isn't very terrific, but it shows the relationship of the trail to where these paintings are. In some cases, so-called primitive man put ladders up and in order to be able to reach where they wanted to do their paintings. But you see here, particularly beautiful, is deer that seem to be holding their head above water. This looks, because that's the natural color of the rock, as if they're swimming along to keep their heads out of water. Throughout Europe are interesting caves. This one is in the old town of Roquefort, and I'm sure you're familiar with Roquefort cheese, but this is where the original Roquefort cheese is made. And it's an old village, and you go into a storefront, and all of a sudden it opens up into a natural cave, and the whole village, the old village, is underlain by caves, and the large wheels of Roquefort are stored there, and in the other end of the town, huge trucks come in the caves, and they're loaded on, so that on the surface you don't see at all what is going on below. For the real Roquefort cheese has to come from Roquefort. So if someone sells you that kind of a cheese, that's what it is. In the town of Lourdes, you see the cathedral here. And as we approached the cathedral, people started pouring out of the ground. And I realized that there was a cave underneath the town. The church services are not held in the cathedral. They're held in this huge cave underneath. And this is the place where Bernadette told of a vision that she saw. And thousands of people came from all over, and still do today, to be cured of their diseases. The easiest, this is the interior of the cave of Lourdes. The easiest caving ever is when you drive along on a highway that enters the cave of Mastacil. And you see the highway going in there. An underground river runs along the highway in the cave, and then halfway through is an entrance to a cave of prehistory, so you get a double treat there. At an international congress years later, we met Vladimir Ilyokin, whom some of you, I think, met when we invited him to the United States. He's the first leader of Soviet speleology, and this was an early congress, and he said that he hoped we could come to the Soviet Republic and that he would work to make it possible. He explained that we would be the first birds to come to Russia for speleology. This tells you, I don't know whether you can see this well, but we start at Moscow and then came down to the Black Sea, all the way around and out into along Afghanistan and to Samarkand, which is on the China Silk route. Little did we know that we were going to be taking a month and being just Vladimir, Russ, and myself all the way across. We met all of the speleo groups as we went across that country and went caving, and certainly was an unusual and experience. In Crimea, not far from Yalta, was a nice limestone horst in a welcoming pit. Like other parts of Europe at the time, cable ladders were still often used for descents. A Russian caver descended before me, and then the surface crew tied me in, and I began my descent. When I got to the bottom, I yelled, "Off rope," and the rope was yanked up tight. I realized then that no one on the surface spoke English. Fortunately, the Soviet caver with me called up and all was well. In one cave, there were unexpectedly a number of patients in beds, as it's believed that the cave air is curative. While things on the surface and the way of life were very different in Russia under Gorbachev, once underground we felt as if we were home again in the familiar surroundings of the cave landscape. On the other side of the Atlantic, we began exploring caves in the island chain of the Caribbean. This is Barbados, but we did a lot of work in Cuba, Puerto Rico, all the way down the chain. And it's interesting that there were so many caves to be discovered. The government of the island of Barbados in the West Indies, contacted us in 1979 and asked us to explore a cave located in the center of the island with the possibility of developing for the public. After we had explored the cave, we reported to the cave is in the center of that island. After we explored the cave, we reported to Prime Minister Adams, shown here in the blue shirt. We explained that we had entered the cave by a flat belly crawl through water for about 100 feet. At that point, it opened into an attractively decorated small cave. We said that we felt the cave could be developed as a pleasant walking tour after constructing another entrance. We did not hear anything for about a year when a frantic call was received from Barbados saying that a man that said he could develop the cave had begun the development by digging large tunnels into the limestone. He struck water that flooded the passageways, and he had tried to redirect the water into pipes overhead. We were asked to finish the job, but when we saw the water dripping from the pipes overhead and the deep mud covering the floor, Russ and I had a long discussion as to whether we should attempt such a project. We finally agreed and hired the men whom the government recommended to help with the underground work. In knee boots for about 2 or 3 months, we had to conquer the water and then clear away the debris throughout the cave. None of the workers had ever had cave experience, and some had never been employed before. The government had instructed us to teach the men skills that they would be able to use after the cave development was completed. I divided my time underground with the men, and then on the surface in this building above the cave, writing reports to government and preparing publications that included the cave map and all of the technical plans for the work. The work ethic there was left a little bit to be desired, and when I go in the cave, you know, I sometimes couldn't find them. And so I discovered that what I had to do is early one morning make a slip of paper for each man of what he was to accomplish that day. And it was not very much, but at least I assumed that we could move ahead. But this was the team that worked underground. The publication is always an important part of the work, so that after we've left, those who administer and care for the cave have an accurate record for reference. While lighting this particular cave, the philosophy was that we would light those areas that were highly decorated and keep in darkness the problems of the first development. We planned the cave tour to go to the well-decorated areas, and because the tunnels were so large and the previous developer had planned a vehicle tour, it was necessary for us also to plan for vehicles. We were soon on our way to Pennsylvania to find the kind of vehicle that would be suitable for Harrison's Cave. Meantime, a local Barbadian architect designed and supervised the building of the visitor center, and in time all was ready for opening day. And so our work was done. And meanwhile, Russ made drawings that he submitted to the Barbados government of his ideas for new Barbados postage stamps. It wasn't until we were home again and that we received this envelope in the mail with 4 of Russ's drawings on stamps, a nice remember of the Barbados experience. Let's make a quick stop in Venezuela, where we explored back in 1959. We traveled to caves in the valley of Caracas with our host, local caver Eugenio de Belard. While hiking to one cave, I remember following the little native guide, Hernandez, when Eugenio said, "Eyes everywhere, men, for the deadly fertile ants." Not fond of snakes, I continued walking when a couple of minutes later, Hernandez leaped off the trail and came up with a coral snake. Meanwhile, Eugenio said that the next day we would leave on a trip south toward the Orinoco River, where he wanted us to explore a special cave where large hawk-like birds live full-time. After traveling 17 hours by jeep, we arrived at the cave in the little town of Caripe. We learned that the natives killed these birds that inhabit the cave for the oil that they secrete that does not have to be refrigerated. When we entered, the screams and the shrieks of the guacharos were deafening. Soon we were standing in complete darkness, surrounded by thousands of guacharo birds flying fitfully around us and sounding like this. Along with this was a clicking sound, which was their echolocation as they flew in the complete darkness of the cave. Shining our lights upward, we could see the nests of the guacharo birds high up on the walls. Later at dusk, we saw the birds exit the cave in search of food. Quite a sight to see so many of these large birds whirling out of the cave entrance. And here's a photo of 2 guacharos. On the long jeep ride back to Caracas, we encouraged Eugenio to contact the Venezuelan government to have the cave protected. And when we were back home again, we received a letter from him with the good news that the Guacharo Cave was now under government protection as a preserve, and that no longer may anyone enter and disturb these unique birds. In South America, we had discovered and worked in caves in Guatemala, really all over in various places. From Guatemala City up to the almost Mexican border, also the Petén. We worked up here on the border of Belize, Lanquin, which we are going to talk about next, so that it's a wonderful country for caves. After one of these trips, we learned that the vice president of ABC Television had approached the Explorers Club because they wanted to film scientific exploration as it was happening. The filming would be for the first time in sync sound and color, which would mean carrying along 32 automobile batteries charged by several portable gasoline generators to provide enough light in the caves to do the job. I should mention that as we went out into where we had to go, we had mules, we had muleteers that we had to pay every day, and all these batteries and all this equipment had to be carried on horseback. On one of the previous trips, Russ and I had lived in this thatched house near the town of Lanquin. I always had a fire handy for cooking meals. We knew that we could propose a plan for an expedition to the Alta Verapaz and fulfill what ABC wanted. In 1968, our proposal was accepted, and professional cinematographer Sid Dobish would head the camera crew. And so in that year, a group of 11 explorers and a camera crew of 6 were soon headquartered in the town of Lanquin. Early the next morning, we headed on horseback into the interior. During the time of the expedition, we explored and mapped 17 caves, but the most interesting was probably a ceremony in the cave of Lanquin. Before dawn one morning, we saw a procession of Mayan Indians approaching the cave entrance, beating drums as they went. So we have the Maya connection with our convention here today. We followed in the darkness as the procession entered the cave, while the sound of their drums reverberated off the walls. The leaders knelt at an altar-like place as they chanted and burned palm, which is sort of like an incense. Days later, in another cave, we witnessed a similar ceremony. The activity had already begun when we entered with our flashlights shielded, as we didn't want to disturb the proceedings. As I backed into the darkness, before I knew it, I'd slid down about 15 feet into a pit. Fortunately, there was no problem crawling up and out, although Russ wondered where I had disappeared to. On the final day, we pulled some rocks out around a hole and discovered another cave. When we rappelled down to a room, we saw a ceremonial burial, bare footprints on the cave floor, and this pot that Dick Gould, who is our team archaeologist, brought back with us to Guatemala City for the museum there. There were other caves and another experience when I saw a number of vampire bats, some of them crawling on the floor, sort of like a crab-like walk. This was the last thing that I remember before leaving for home. In 1989, the government of the island of Anguilla in the West Indies asked us to do a study of Fountain Cave. They would cover expenses of a team, and we would produce a publication covering the cave and its contents, as well as a possible recommendation and process for its development for visitors. We were soon on our way in a small plane flying the connection from St. Martin to Anguilla. We wasted no time after arrival and were soon in Fountain Cave, owned by the government. There was a small hole in a pit entrance, and probably the ancient people let themselves down on these vines to enter. I was exploring along a shelf in the cave when I came to these petroglyphs. Later, I asked a local artist to reproduce these in line drawings because the carvings didn't show up well in photographs. Each carving was perfect in itself, and I plan to reproduce the drawings in the publication I'd prepare for the Anguillan government. Nearby, a 6-meter-high stalagmite had been carved into a statue. We made a cave survey and placed on a map of the cave where a trail could be constructed away from the petroglyphs and still allow visitors to see them. Plans for the publication would include recommendations for a way that the cave could be developed by creating a new entrance and a trail that would circle an attractive cave, with the petroglyphs as the last part of the tour. The government hasn't yet gone ahead with this project. There are many more expeditions and countries around the world, but some wise man once said, the mind can absorb no more than the seat can endure. So I will end with a few projects in Puerto Rico, the island where, beginning in the 1950s, we began exploring previously unknown and unexplored caves. Just for a quick orientation, this is San Juan over here. This is the north coast, Arecibo, and this map was made before a road went in, when we even were developing the cave. There wasn't any road there, and the cave area is right here. There are two rivers, the Rio Camuy, which flows north to the north coast, and parallel to it is the Tanama. So keep those in mind because we're going to explore the Tanama a little bit later. On an early trip, we drove through these mogotes, or haystack hills, and along a river that we noticed from the road disappeared underground. We saw two men with machetes cutting brush along the road and asked them if they knew of a cave. They happily stopped their work and took us to the ravine that led to the entrance of the upper level of Rio Kamui Cave. This started us on almost yearly visits to this area with teams supported by the Explorers Club, Life magazine, and National Geographic. Publications included a map of the area and cave, geology, biology reports, and descriptions of the areas explored. At first we thought the deep cave would be what could be developed, but on one trip we were paddling along when I noticed that there were branches and mud stuck to the ceiling of the cave. The cave sometimes flooded to the ceiling. One of the great features was what we named Tres Pueblos Sinkhole, 3 towns. A sinkhole 300 feet deep and 600 feet across, with the Rio Kamui flowing across the bottom. On one trip, Stuart Peck found a colony of tiny white crustaceans only 6 millimeters long in a pool in the cave that he determined were a new genus and species that he named Jeanne Gurnee. It's the lower one that's the eyeless one. I'm not so sure it's so great having an eyeless albino water creature named after you. We'd been camping out of doors, but when we were spending so much time in Puerto Rico, a Puerto Rican friend who was an attorney said, "Why don't you buy some land near the cave?" He soon arranged for us to buy 27 acres that included the cave entrance and this little house that became our headquarters. After years of work, we submitted maps to the government indicating the particular parcels of land that could be purchased as a park and preserve. In time, they bought the land and then asked us to develop the upper passage that we had suggested. You can see that circle, there's the Tres Pueblos sinkhole, and those are all the parcels that we had delineated that fortunately they bought. Meanwhile, Russ had discovered another opening to the cave, and we decided to use this as the visitor entrance. It would avoid having visitors begin their tour through the natural entrance that had a fine view from below on the trail, especially in late afternoon when the sun's rays extended down onto the trail. Visitors would then continue through the cave to the back opening, the Empalme sinkhole. Visitors can look upward 400 feet toward the sky. Our project was how to get all the construction equipment plus all the men into the cave every day. The walk through the ravine, which led to the natural entrance, would probably take each one of us an hour or so. The ravine that led to the entrance of the cave was heavy tropical vegetation, and we wanted to make a meandering trail through this to the visitor entrance. This took Jack Birch and me plus 2 men with machetes a couple of months to lay out. It was kind of complicated to do. Meantime, Russ and Bill Stone designed an elevator that would go down the Empalme sinkhole and bring us, the men, and equipment swiftly down into the cave every day. We will remove this at the end of the development, but it helped us get everything down fast. We had taken a trip to Pennsylvania and found and ordered the type of vehicles that would take people on a tour from the visitor center and down the ravine to the cave entrance, so that on opening day, December 16th, 1986, the grand opening provided a great experience for both the people of Puerto Rico and visitors to the island. It's hard to believe, but the deep cave has not yet been fully explored. Before going home, we heard about a phenomenon we wanted to see. One evening when it was almost dark, I ran down a little valley toward the entrance to a shallow pit entrance and cave that local people had told me about. As I got near the pit entrance, I ducked down a little to avoid some branches that were hanging overhead. Just as I ducked down, Russ grabbed me by the nape of the neck and to hold me back. I looked up to see that the branches were really snakes hanging down from the trees over the entrance, striking out at the hundreds of bats that were flying out of the entrance. The snakes were so busy catching bats that I went down into the cave where the floor was covered with bat skeletons. And the final trip we wanted to take was on the Tanama River. That's the river that runs parallel to the Kamoy toward the north coast. We had heard that no one had ever traversed it, probably because rubber boats were not available on the island at that time. It seemed a good idea to take the rubber boats we had on the island and run it. We put in the boats and started on our way. All of a sudden, we saw that there was a cave ahead that spanned the river. The water swiftly carried us along as we paddled into the blackness. We could see a pinpoint of light ahead, the cave exit. We had hardly gotten out of the cave when the river constricted and turned turbulent. I tried to paddle regularly, but it was impossible, and the boat spun around and around in the water. The only solution was to just go wherever the boat took us, sometimes going over waterfalls backwards. The water was to carry us through 6 caves altogether, and finally we were able to paddle to calm water and a takeout point. There were many more countries in the Pacific Rim, Hawaii, and South America that we explored, but it is time to end with this photo that is not of a sunset, but of a sunrise over all the lands of the world that have caves just waiting for all of us to discover. Thank you. If you have any questions, please, I'll give them a try. Yes?
I just have to run to a meeting, but I'm from Puerto Rico. I think I'm in the second generation of this exploration. I just want to hesitate to point it out, to encourage other people to do what we do, what you have done, and yeah, hopefully we'll keep you for a while, telling us stuff.
Thank you. Yes?
I just want to attest that your imitation of the guacharo bird, the oil bird in Venezuela, is exactly right.
It really is.
I am the granddaughter, the godchild of Juan Antonio Tronchoni, who you had in a picture there.
Oh, really?
And I cried of excitement.
Oh, my
And
goodness.
just seeing him next to you.
Oh.
I recently, Ramon Hernandez, who guided you through that river and you talked about, recently died, but remembered you until the last day.
Oh, I don't know.
Yes,
Can everyone hear her?
Thank you for
Yeah.
the memories. You and your husband are remembered dearly with love in many places, and you represent those in Venezuela that remember you. So thank you.
Well, I hope to talk with you afterwards. Thank you. This is something that cavers want to do. You know, when you go into foreign countries, be sure that you don't go in like you're the big guys, you know. Find the local cavers, find the local people. Make good relationships in these countries before you begin exploration. Anyone else? Well, it's been a pleasure talking for you today. Thank you.